the big argument when I tell people that I'm concerned about falling birth rates, the number one response that I will get from most people is, but isn't it actually a good thing? Because we're close to the carrying capacity of the earth. We're clearly having a very destructive effect on the planet, which I agree. I agree on that. Isn't it a good thing, they say, that we kind of gently dwindle as a species worldwide? What do you say to that argument?
Well, in the book I'm working on at the moment, I suggest there are three reasons for having children: the three P's: the personal, the practical, and the philosophical. On the personal, I think it certainly made me very happy having kids and now grandchildren. The most important thing and valuable thing in my life, but that's just my preferences. But if you look at what people say they want by way of children versus what they have, there's a shortfall. If you look at people when they are post having children, in their 60s, say, would you wish to have had more or fewer? Most people say more or the same. Very few people say fewer. There are certain health benefits of having children to do with living longer. Certain cancers are more likely. It's not very, very clear, but there are actual health advantages, it would appear, in having kids. And I think actually navigating the system when you're very old, not having any children to do it, is very difficult. So I think there are sort of personal reasons. So far as the practical is concerned, the problem is we can't shrink our population while retaining the current structure. What happens when a population declines is you have people living longer, which of course we want, and then they have fewer children, and so you end up with an inverted pyramid. And what you end up with is a demand for labour driven by the size of the population and a supply of labour driven by the size of the working population. And if the relationship between the total population and the working population gets out of sync, you end up, now, where are we in England now, or in the UK now? Early days of the impact of low fertility. It's 50 years, but we're only now feeling the impact. And we have really sluggish growth. We have massive immigration, and we're still terribly short of labour. So I think that's a huge problem. And if people are going to consume labour, it's got to come from somewhere. And then the philosophical arguments, I think, I'm very opposed to this anti-natalism of people like David Benatar. We probably don't have time to get into that, but there's a sort of philosophical argument and a religious argument. Coming back, though, specifically to the environmental argument, I tend to be a subscriber to the school of Julian Simon rather than Paul Ehrlich. You may know they had a famous bet on the price of commodities, which Simon won. And Simon very much was pushing the idea that more brains create more productive capacity in the world. I think a young, growing world where life is vital and young is more likely to come up with the solutions to the problems we have than a world in which everyone's getting grey and we're overly worrying and totally focused on how we manage our old age population. I think we can already see countries like Japan, which are getting older, are not coming up with a number of patents and good ideas that they were when they were younger countries. And if we're going to solve the environmental problems of the world, I think we need good young brains to do that. We should see every baby not as another emitter, but as another potential brain to solve the problem. And the human brain is, as Julian Simon said, the ultimate resource. If we are heading to zero carbon emissions in 20 or 30 years, which I think is feasible, or we're told is feasible in much of the developed world, then a baby born today should not be contributing very highly to emissions. I mean, if you look at the emissions decline in Britain per capita over the last 30 years, it's been very impressive. I know it's going to be harder going forward, but it should be soluble. And I would say the last thing we should do, if we are worried about the environment, is have fewer children. There are so many other things we could sacrifice. If that's necessary, we could travel less. We could heat our homes less. I don't think that's necessary, and I don't advocate it. But the last thing, if it were down to me, I'm very happy I had 3 kids. I'm not suggesting everyone should have 6 or 7. I'm not suggesting we should have eternal, endless, runaway population growth. But I do think that having 2 to 3 children should be something that is, on average, obviously some will have more, some will have fewer, as a society, should be something which is cognizant with or can fit with um, reducing our emissions, looking after the environment better. I think economic development, urbanization, are ways that you release huge amounts of the countryside to the environment. So there are lots of green reasons for saying not that the population should double and double, we should have 100 billion people and so on, but for saying actually we have a problem with rapid aging and people having on average 2 to 3 children should be something that, with our ingenuity as a human species, we should be able to cope with at the same time as caring for the environment.
Yeah, I find the human rhetoric associated with some of this environmental stuff very troubling. I think that all of the ideologies currently in circulation, this one is a pretty mainstream one. It seems to me to be really one of the most, possibly the most anti-human, um, which is somehow sort of excused on the basis of it. I don't know, having a virtuous brand or something. But yes, I think there are some quite sinister implications actually. If you think too carefully about something like Population Matters or one of these other organisations, which is really intent on reducing the human population worldwide.
Well, it's ultimately positioning humans as a problem.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, and in direct conflict with with other species and with the planet. Which, it's not entirely untrue. There clearly are ways in which we have a negative impact on the planet, but actually our negative impact on the planet has been reducing over time, if anything. And there are lots of ways in which our modern lives are now much cleaner and greener than they were even 100 years ago. So it's not a consistent historical pattern by any means. There isn't this sort of unbreakable link between human population size and negative impact on the planet.
Now, if you want to be environmentally aware in a developed country, the best thing to do is to move into the city, where your amenities will be provided much more efficiently. Your home will probably be smaller, but it will also be better insulated. Your journey to work, if you travel into work, will be more likely to be feasible by public transport. Um, whilst it's kind of a bit counterintuitive in a way, but an efficient urban lifestyle can today be very environmental. And of course, you're freeing up space in the countryside and more room for nature, effectively, if we concentrate in the cities.
And have heaps of kids. This is, well, not necessarily heaps of kids, but I'm sure you've seen the Haredi Jewish community renovations that they've done to some houses in North London, where they've added an entire extra story to these period buildings, and it actually looks really good because the local council allowed them to do it. It's a beautiful example of gentle density in the urban environment. So there are ways around this.
Well, I live in a very Jewish area, and it's a great pleasure to see the streets full of children, actually, which is not something you see in many parts of London.
No, you really don't. And I hear this as well about I've never been to South Korea, in large part because I have a toddler, so traveling to South Korea is not very practical. But I hear that, for instance, there are signs everywhere saying things like "children not welcome in this restaurant" or whatever, which seems fairly pointless given how few children there are. But I suppose you end up, when there are very few children, the norm becomes children not being in public life, and so you end up with a kind of vicious cycle of antinatalism.
As people get less used to seeing children around, I think they find them more annoying. I mean, it's probably not a very good analogy, but when I was a kid, everyone smoked. And I really didn't mind being in a smoky environment. Now, if there's anyone smoking, I immediately start coughing and feeling uncomfortable. And I don't want to draw the analogy to children and smoking, the one I'm very positive about, the other very negative. But I think if people are not used to, I sit in my garden and I hear children screaming and playing and fighting and running around. I think it's wonderful. But if you hardly ever heard that, and then you encounter it, you're probably more likely to be annoyed by it. So as fertility rates fall, people's tolerance for children falls. And I think that's an awful position to be in. And it's a death knell for a society, really.